Well, Patrick, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this roundtable. I've found the comments up to this point fascinating, and I'd like to just try and illustrate some of the views that I included in my provocation response, but also expand on them in the context of what's been said this morning by showing a few slides which will help illustrate some of the comments that I'm about to make. Now first, it's very important to keep in mind that Russia is a very major energy producer and supplier. It ranks in the top 5 in the world in all of the 5 major primary energy categories in terms of production. It also ranks in the top 5 in terms of reserves of both gas and coal, where it's 1 and 2, and it's number 7 in oil. One thinks a lot about the Middle East in oil, but Russia remains the number 1 producer in the world, number 7 in terms of reserves. Now, there are a number of factors that come into play in terms of looking at Russia's strategy with regard to its energy, and some of these tie into the comments that Patrick made earlier about the question of what is post-communism versus communism. What we've experienced is that there's still very much a command and control mentality governing the energy sector. There is an unwillingness really to relinquish the kind of control that would exist by allowing major private sector intervention. In the mid-1990s, when Yeltsin was president, there was a kind of roller coaster ride with a move to widespread privatization, the introduction of the vertically integrated companies in Russia, along with loans for shares schemes, which made a number of people extremely rich by acquiring very valuable assets at very low cost. There was also a concerted effort to try and attract foreign investment. A production sharing agreement law was passed in 1995. Neighboring legislation was passed in 1999. But also in 1999, Putin published a paper in which he articulated the view that the oil and gas sector was too important to be left out of the control of the government. It should either be under the direct control or at the very least under the aegis of government. When he became president, one of the patterns that changed fairly dramatically was a move towards renationalization of parts of the industry, either fully, in the case of a company like Yukos, which was effectively taken away from Khodorkovsky, broken up and given to Rosneft and Gazprom, or indirectly by putting a lot of influence on people like Roman Abramovich with his company and others who were essentially persuaded that they needed to toe the government line, and effectively the government succeeded in re-establishing that control. One of the other changes that Russia experienced with the breakup of the Soviet Union was that having had an integrated transport system to deliver in particular gas to Western Europe, and this went back to a major initiative back in the 1980s when they built the export lines to Europe, one of the changes was all of a sudden they no longer controlled that system. They were subject to some extent to the whim of the transit countries. They were subject to what Ukraine might do. They were subject to what Moldova might do. They were subject to Belarus's actions. All 3 countries had no real love for Russia and therefore weren't necessarily going to toe the Russian line in terms of what Russia wanted. The first attempt Russia made to try and resolve this situation, deal with what we often term the obsolescing bargain, where as the investments go in, the leverage changes from the investor to the company, the host government. What happened was that they decided that they would try and bypass these countries. And so as you can see from the map of gas pipelines, you have the Nord Stream pipeline that Matt mentioned. You have South Stream. Nord Stream, by the way, was initially inaugurated in November last year, so it's now operational. South Stream is a proposed line that will basically bypass Ukraine. This effectively will allow Russia to reduce the amount of dependence on Belarus and Ukraine as transit countries to only a nominal level. Part again of the command control type of mentality. Now, another reason for this command control mentality on the energy sector, and it applies not just in Russia, but it applies all the way along the supply chain in the former Soviet Union, is that the energy sector historically has been a huge cash cow. The gas sector in particular has been a magnet for corruption. This is part of the explanation as to why when gas negotiations go on between Ukraine and Russia, they take place at the top level of government. They don't send some head of department from Naftogaz to talk to somebody in Gazprom. Tymoshenko, when she was prime minister, went to talk to Putin. Now, those discussions are not just about what the price of gas is going to be, but they're also about the issue of how the rents get distributed. Back in 2007, December 2007, the Guardian newspaper put out a report that Putin had accumulated a $40 billion fortune from the energy sector. This was a claim made by a Russian political expert, Stanislaw Belkovsky, and he made the claim in an interview to Die Welt, which was then followed up and substantiated in the interview that he had with The Guardian. This particular view is actually generally believed, and it perhaps helps explain some of the actions associated with the way Putin approaches his political career. If you look at his political career through the prism of somebody who has accumulated vast wealth as a result of his position as a politician, you perhaps understand that he doesn't want to see that position diminished in any fashion. What's the best way to do that? Well, stay in power. If you stay in power, somebody can't take that particular set of assets away from you. Another factor that influences the Russian psyche is their planning horizon. Historically, the countries in the former Soviet Union relied on such programs as their centralized planning system with the Gosplan. But in reality, the real planning horizon was relatively short and became even shorter after the breakup of the Soviet Union. For many of the officials in government, the real planning horizon from a long-term standpoint is at best several months, maybe a year. It's not 5 years, it's not 10 years. What may occur in a 10-year plus time frame is something that's so far out in the future, as far as many of these people are concerned, that they really are not particularly interested in trying to spend money or deal with the situation now. And this is one of the reasons why the country has been underinvesting in its gas sector. Russia needs to spend about $15 billion a year simply to be able to maintain its gas production levels. It would need to spend about $20 billion a year over a 10-year period if it's to be able to maximize the value of this resource and increase production levels correspondingly. Gazprom represents about 80% of Russia's production. So Gazprom, just to maintain production, ought to be spending about $12 billion a year. Between 2001 and 2008 inclusive, the total amount spent by Gazprom was $36 billion, whereas what they really ought to have been spending was about 3 times that amount of money. Now, for a period of time, production is going to be able to be maintained. We think that perhaps for the next 5 years it will be possible for Russia to maintain production, but at some point the natural laws of field depletion kick in and production will start to decline. Effectively, it's likely to fall off a cliff. So what we're looking at is a scenario where Russia, with its investments required, with the investments being way under what they need, faces the prospect that it's actually going to see, by the time we get out to the mid-2020s, an inability to continue to export while maintaining deliveries to the domestic market, which puts then the Russian government in a conundrum. Are they going to supply the domestic market, or are they going to maintain their exports? If they supply the domestic market, they're clearly going to have to cut back on export levels, which has implications for Western Europe. If they maintain the export levels, they've got to find some substitute forms of energy within Russia in order to be able to compensate. Now, we saw an example in February this year of how they reacted to that situation. There was a huge cold snap in Europe. In fact, a large number of people died from hypothermia because of that cold snap. Russia was facing a presidential election coming up in March, did not want to upset the population. Therefore, Russia kept the domestic population fully supplied with gas. Western Europe saw a big cutback in gas supplies, which caused considerable consternation in Western Europe. But looking out into the future, this situation is likely to become more frequent, as Matt said, rather than less frequent. We saw the situation in 2006 and 2009 with disruptions on supplies because of the relationship between Ukraine and Russia. Looking further on, it's not just going to be that will impact the potential for supplies coming into Europe. It will be the availability of gas that Russia can put its hands on. Now, the obvious place for Russia to go and try and get more gas is Central Asia, particularly Turkmenistan. But Turkmenistan is getting into bed with China. China has come in and made investments to move gas from Turkmenistan to China. And while Russia has made commitments to supply a total of 68 billion cubic meters to China, this was announced a couple of years ago in a big announcement when Putin was in Beijing, it's not at all clear where that supply is going to come from. So Russia's been scrambling around looking at other potential sources of gas supply. What they don't seem to be doing, however, is putting aside the funding to really go ahead now and increase the investments necessary in order to deliver the gas. Now, just to clarify a little bit on the numbers, yes, the next phase of gas production in Russia is going to be more expensive than the past phase, but in long-run marginal cost terms, Russia can still produce gas for well under $100 a thousand cubic meters. Right now, under the formulaic price they're operating with, which is tied to oil, gas prices for the gas that they sell into Europe range between $400 and $550, depending on the location where the gas goes. Europe hasn't yet seen the gas-to-gas competition that forced down the gas price and increased this huge margin in the United States. Now, Europe itself faces a bit of a conundrum, because Europe has set a series of goals. It set its 20-20-20 goals, which means a 20% reduction in emissions, 20% use of renewable energy by 2020. The only way that Europe, and this is the European Union, the only way that the European Union countries are going to be able to achieve this is, realistically, is with increased use of nuclear energy. This brings us then back to Fukushima. One of the consequences of Fukushima was increased pressure in Germany to reduce the use of nuclear. Germany, in fact, has made a commitment to phase out of nuclear. The question now is, how is Germany going to replace the energy requirement that they are having to meet if they aren't going to be able to do it with nuclear? The solution for them, the most friendly solution, is going to be natural gas, given the volumes that are required. It's not realistic for Germany to be able to rely on sources of renewable energy in order to be able to meet that level of demand. One of the problems with renewable energy, or many forms of renewable energy, particularly solar and wind, is the uncertainty about availability, and you have to have a critical baseload of energy in order to be able to maintain the integrity of the system. That means large hydropower or fossil fuels, or nuclear. Those are the only three options that exist. Germany is essentially taking itself away from one of those options. It doesn't have the option of turning to large hydropower. That leaves it only with the choice of fossil fuels. The preference, as far as they're concerned, would be natural gas rather than other forms of fossil fuels. But then the question is, where's that supply going to come from? Now, overall, the investment needs in the sector, and I'll come back and talk a little bit more about that, the investment needs in the sector in all the area of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union are huge. They need about $3.3 trillion between now and 2035, which is equivalent to about 3% of cumulative GDP. Absent that, the countries are simply going to find their economies being adversely impacted by the lack of available energy supplies. Now, in work that's been done by the World Bank and EBRD, we've found that electricity supply is one of the critical factors raised by businesses as being an impediment to doing business. If these kinds of investments don't take place, that impediment is only going to get larger. Okay, let me come back. I won't touch on this slide yet, but let me come back and talk a little bit more about the shale gas situation. Unconventional gas has got a lot of people very excited, but again, as Matt had mentioned, there are a huge number of challenges. At this point in time, Poland is the one country that's really going hard to try and promote shale gas development. They've issued over 100 concession licenses to some 20 companies, which range from fairly small independents to large multinationals, including Chevron, ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, Marathon. At this point, however, there has yet to be a commercial discovery made. There have been quite a number of wells drilled, but the commercial discoveries haven't happened. Once the commercial discoveries take place, and that's still an assumption, there's still obviously a certain amount of hope involved there, then the country can move on into the development phase. Next big challenge. There are about 100 land rigs available in Europe as a whole, as against about over 2,500 operating rigs in the United States. The 100 land rigs are about enough to be able to meet the initial pilot, the exploration phase, and some pilot development phases, but are nowhere near enough to be able to exploit this resource effectively as and when it's discovered. So the enthusiasm about shale gas and unconventional gas development in Europe may be a little bit premature. There may have to be some real management of the expectations in terms of what that resource can do. Poland's certainly very optimistic. They've actually reduced their reserve estimates. The US Geological Service went in and made an initial estimate of about 5.3 trillion cubic meters of gas. The Poland Geological Service, on March 21st, issued a revised estimate in which they showed that they believed the recoverable gas range would be between 345 and 768 billion cubic meters, which is obviously a substantial reduction, still enough to meet Poland's own gas demands for between 35 and 65 years. But again, this is all based on trying to extrapolate largely from US data, not based on a huge amount of hard data from drilling within Poland itself. But it does remain an interesting area, and it's an area which Russia is kind of nervous about, because Russia has seen what's happened in the United States in the last few years with the gas-to-gas competition, and is concerned about the possibility that a shale gas revolution in Europe could put pressure on Russia's ability to maintain its export position. All this notwithstanding the fact that Russia isn't investing adequately in its own upstream. So we've got this conundrum that we face, this inconsistency in terms of what they're concerned about and what they're actually doing. Just as an example of where Russia is imposing its influence in this regard, Bulgaria recently imposed a complete ban on hydrofracturing. This came without any public consultation, came without any real response from the industry, and it's largely believed that this was the result of pressure from Overgas, which is the gas distributor in Bulgaria, which is an affiliate of Gazprom. And so the industry believes that it was essentially Russian influence that caused Bulgaria to put this moratorium in place. Well, in the context of this whole conundrum, we look at the energy intensity issues. One of the places that we can go to try and see some improvement in the energy supply-demand balance is energy efficiency. Right now, this part of the world has the highest energy intensity per capita of any region in the world. And even by 2030, it's estimated that the region will still have 3 times the energy intensity per capita of the European Union, and that Russia will be something like 5 times the energy intensity per capita. Now, what that translates into is continuing carbon emissions. And if we look here, this is a chart which basically indicates the carbon dioxide emissions per capita in tons, and then has a comparison on the GDP side. And it indicates that this is a region which, again, in per capita terms, is showing a very high level of emissions. But the discussion on climate change doesn't gain very much traction in these countries. As far as they're concerned, and it comes back to Judith Shapiro's comments, they're basically taking the view that, well, in terms of absolute emissions, we're a lot lower than the United States, than China. Our per capita numbers are a lot lower than the United States. Why should we have to cut back if countries like the United States don't cut back? And so this whole energy emissions discussion gets impacted by the fact that these countries are interested in preserving their own outlook for the future. Facing energy shortages, where are they going to turn in terms of trying to meet those shortages? In all likelihood, they will turn towards higher polluting fuels rather than lower polluting fuels. We're already starting to see the return of more lignite burning in a number of countries in Eastern Europe. For example, Turkey, which back in the late 1980s was highly polluted in cities like Istanbul. Istanbul at that time was rated by the British Foreign Office as the second most polluted city where British diplomats had to reside in the world. Mexico City was rated the worst at that particular point in time. Natural gas came in, cleaned the city right up. Last 2 or 3 years, with high gas prices, we've seen the return of burning of lignite. And so the pollution is starting to return, and of course the carbon dioxide emissions are starting to increase at the same time. It really is a difficult challenge that everybody faces, and because we've got these conflicting objectives where the highly developed countries have at least the ability to be able to operate with lower levels of energy intensity, the less developed countries, the middle-income countries, the poorer countries, are still arguing that they ought to be able to gain their share of the economic pot and their share of the associated use of energy before they're forced to cut back on the level of emissions that they have, which creates a huge challenge as far as industry is concerned. And just to close, I'd like to leave you with one final thought, which maybe seem like it's jumping a little bit compared with what we've been talking about. But this is a quote from Ismail Serageldin, who is former World Bank Vice President and was the chairman of the World Commission for Water in the 21st century. In 1999, he made the comment that the wars in the last century were about oil. The wars in the next century will be about water. And I think it's important to keep in mind that this whole energy equation, the impact on climate change, doesn't stop with the energy side alone. It moves on to looking at the whole issue of water resources. Do we start looking at what's happening in Central Asia, for example, there are some very real concerns there. There are threats to agriculture, there are threats to their ability to produce hydropower in the future. There are a whole series of other issues that are going to come into play. Indeed, what we see at the moment is the risk of a war between Tajikistan and Uzbekistan related to Tajikistan's proposals to build the Rogun Dam, a huge hydropower dam in Central Asia, where the Uzbeks take the view that you're essentially stealing our water if you do that, and we're not going to let you do it. With Uzbekistan having the second largest standing army in the former Soviet Union, it's by no means an idle threat. Thank you.
Thank you.